3 weeks after he left, she walked into a closed restaurant, with the last of her money in her pocket, and a photograph in her purse. She had $21,000. A faded recipe book, wrapped in a paper napkin, and a folded photograph of her grandmother that smelled faintly of bay and thyme. The sign on the glass said for lease. The door stuck, the lock ground, before it gave. When it opened, dust met her like an old apology. She called it Tremaine because the name sounded like a promise. The building was on Edgewood Avenue, 2 blocks from where the street finally decided it was too old for pretense, and settled into honesty. Inside, the kitchen smelled like desertion. Cold ovens, a grease-streaked hood, a line of empty fryers like ribs under a cloth. The dining room was small, 4 booths, 3 tables, a counter with a cracked laminate top. A faded menu listing soul food staples had been glued to a chalkboard years ago, and left to yellow. She had not planned to buy a restaurant that morning. She had planned to pick up another day, look at the place, think about it, tell herself she could never. The papers had come 2 weeks earlier. He signed. He moved his name. He rearranged titles and accounts and trusts the way a man rearranges furniture in a house he already owns, with an air of inevitability, the lawyer told her, in a voice meant to be kind and precise, that she had been left with the things that fit in a single cardboard box. The photograph fit. The recipe book fit. The bills did not. So when the real estate agent met her in the doorway and ran a hand across the counter and asked if she'd like to put in an offer, Loretta did the thing people do when the world narrows. She spent all she had, $21,000, the last of the savings she had tucked away in small stacks, and remembering, she signed again. This time with her own hand, and her own name. She left a key in the lock, and slept that night on the floor beside the counter, the photograph under her cheek. Like a talisman, she woke before dawn the next day and went straight to the back. Kitchens have their own geography. A narrow corridor becomes an alley. A door labeled storage is a promise in capital letters. She pushed it open. Light came in a thin bar from the side window, and caught dust motes that hung like a tiny congregation. At first she thought they were jars, rows of glass on a shelf, then she saw the crates. Wooden, weathered, stamped with a name she'd only ever seen written in her grandmother's careful looped script, Estelle May Williams. Her grandmother's handwriting had always had a rhythm to it, like a song written with a fountain pen. Here, on paper labels sealed with wax, that handwriting looked younger than the woman in the photograph Loretta kept in her purse. She touched the wax seal with a fingertip. The wax left a light, red dust on her skin. She lifted a bottle out of the crate. It was small, full to the shoulder, the oil and vinegar inside, catching the morning light like a little health sun. A label wrapped round its belly. Red, Torre Morishnaru Estelle May Williams. The cap was further timed with a circle of beaten wax. She sniffed. The smell that rose into her face was sharp and immediate. Cayenne, bright vinegar, a memory of butter, and something almost floral beneath it, an aroma that made the memory of Tuesdays in a small kitchen flood back, of a wooden spoon tapping the side of a pot, of her grandmother humming a hymn under her breath as she cooked. 31 bottles. She counted them again because counting is a way of keeping the world from sliding. 31. Every one sealed, each one the same, except for the slight differences in the handwriting. On the paper, labels some sloped left, some right, some abbreviated Estelle, as E. May. There was the photograph, too, tucked into a corner of a crate, and a paper folder that looked like it had been hidden between wooden slats. When she opened the folder, the paper smelled like old glue and the kind of ink that never quite fades. There were letters, an envelope, and a thin stack of typed pages, with what looked like signatures at the bottom. The top page read, Manufacturing Agreement, Trami Original, 1987. She sat on the concrete floor with a bottle in each hand, and hugged them to her chest, feeling ridiculous and precisely right all at once. The photograph in her purse she took out, and compared to the older woman, in the black and white image, now propped against a crate. Estelle was wearing an apron in both pictures. Sleeves rolled, one hand on a wooden spoon. Loretta pressed her thumb to a corner, where a crease ran through Estelle's smile. The paper was warm from her hand. She had carried this photograph for 30 years. She had carried the recipe book for the same. Loretta grew up in Tremaine, where the houses leaned toward the street like neighbors sharing secrets. Estelle's kitchen had been the axis of that house. A cluttered little room where everything that mattered arrived through the steam: birthdays, funerals, marriages, baptisms. Estelle bottled sauce not to sell at first but because she liked keeping things ready. She labeled the jars with tape and a practiced hand. She loved names. She loved order. The recipe book was a collection of folds and marginal notes. A pinch here, a dash there. Instructions in Estelle's script that assumed you already knew how to taste for salt and for mercy. Loretta's life afterwards was quieter, on paper, than it had felt. She married Calvin in 1993. She learned to make ends meet in a way that never made their accountant's charts look prettier. She kept a house, raised a daughter, hosted holiday meals where Estelle's Tremaine finished the plate like a benediction. She did not keep receipts for the love she poured into the home. She did not sign contracts. She signed forms when Calvin put them in front of her. Mortgage papers, acknowledgments, things with a line where her name should go. She trusted that whatever they built would be built together. It ended not with a confrontation, but with an arrangement of documents. Assets were shifted. Trusts were formed. She woke one morning to find whole properties and accounts moved into different names. The lawyer with the kind voice explained that arrangements had been lawful, if cold. Loretta walked out of a courthouse with 2 cardboard boxers, the photograph, the recipe book, and a file of papers that felt like a library loan, stamped with due dates. She did not understand. The $21,000 disappeared as soon as she signed on the Edgewood line, but inside the crates in the cold back of Tremaine, money did not matter. Memory did. She thought, then, of all the things that are never counted on a balance sheet. Estelle taught her to salt by taste, to know a good pepper by the way it woke your tongue. Estelle taught her to bottle something that could hold its flavor through time like a faith. That the bottles existed in a dusty crate was not, at first, a vindication. It was simply an inheritance. It was also proof. She carried the crates home that night, in a borrowed van, with a guy from a roofing crew, who hummed along while Loretta gave him directions. At home, she laid out the bottles, on the dining table. Ruthie, who had worked as a housekeeper for the Simmons family for years, came over when she called. Ruthie had long hands, and a memory like a ledger. She had tried, years before, to tell Loretta things. That Miss Delia Pratt had taken some jars for safekeeping. That the sauce had been useful in another life, when neighborhood stores stocked local flavors, like a promise. Loretta remembered Ruthie's voice then. Miss Loretta, Miss Delia kept the old bottles in the back of her place. She said she'd look after them. Ruthie had been right. Miss Delia Pratt had owned a small counter restaurant in Decatur, decades ago, and when that place closed, she told people she'd boxed Estelle's things and put them in the back. People thought Miss Delia was sentimental. Miss Delia was. Did she remember the exact day she moved them? Loretta did not know, and Miss Delia's memory folded around the years the way a shawl folds around the shoulders of an elder. But Miss Delia had kept them, and in a small pocket of the world where people keep promises that are not written down, she had kept Estelle's bottles. When Loretta showed Ruthie the bottles, Ruthie laughed, and then cried. "Lord have mercy," she said, palm to chest, and the laugh in it sounded like a bell. To Ruthie, the sauce tasted like a map. This place, this woman, this lineage. Ruthie had worked in Estelle's house when Loretta was a child. She had tasted the first drops of Tremaine on cornbread and on boiled greens. To both women, the sauce was a living thing. The paper folder contained more than letters. It contained a line that changed the geometry of everything. The manufacturing agreement was dated 1987. Loretta knew the years and the way people measure life by which song was on the radio. 1987 came before 1993. Before a signature that would later rearrange her life. The agreement had names and a clause assigning the rights to Tremaine original to Estelle and her heirs. The signatures, when she touched them, felt as solid as the wax on a bottle. She did not know what those words meant in a courtroom, but she knew the order of things. The agreement, the later marriage, the transfer of property. Some things were written down before the others. Some things were older than the contracts that tried to bury them. She took the folder to a lawyer who met her in an office where the blinds were too old and the air conditioner clicked like a metronome. He opened the file, thumbed through the pages, and said, simply, "This predates your marriage." The sentence landed like a stone in water, a small, precise impact that made wider circles. He explained, in plain language, she could hold, that Georgia law treats inherited assets as separate property when they can be traced to the original owner. He did not promise victory like a fortune teller. He promised the truth of the paperwork. That steadied her more than anything. "It belongs to your grandmother and her heirs," he said. "On paper, at least. It isn't marital property." It was assigned to her in 1987. She filed papers that week. Filing felt like placing a stake in the ground, with nothing to guard it but a will. She had no illusions that men who had practiced legal circumvention for years would stand quietly and watch. There were already shadows moving at the edge of this new thing she had created. A courthouse, she had learned, was a room where people speak in other words. Until those words become acts. Word travels in neighborhoods by different channels than in offices. Trey, a man who fixed the exhaust on the van she borrowed, mentioned overhearing someone speak of a sauce worth something in the old Fourth Ward. Rohan Elijah Dupree, a food entrepreneur with a quiet reputation for reviving old labels, had been searching for Tremaine Original for months, listening for the name as if it might appear in a crowd. He had been paying attention to the rumble of kitchens and the chatter of markets. When someone told him a woman on Edgewood had opened a place and was talking about Estelle's sauce, he drove over. Rowan arrived the following afternoon carrying a small tin sample box, like someone bringing flowers to a grave. His presence in the doorway of Tremaine was the kind of small, bright interruption that can reroute a life. He smelled of coffee and summer rain. He smiled with a respect that was not quite pity, and not quite business. He did not ask for proof before he tasted. He asked, instead, if he could see the photograph. Loretta watched him as he opened the crate with a care that looked ceremonial. He uncapped a bottle, and poured 2 thin drops onto a paper square. His eyes closed for a second when he tasted it. "My God," he said, and his voice was the one thing in the room that felt decided and whole. "This is it?" he asked. She handed him the photograph. He placed the paper square beside it, like a liturgy. Rowan talked about legacy with the kind of vocabulary that did not reduce people to assets. "This is a real American thing," he said. "Not just a sauce. It's memory. That's rare." He talked about partnership in terms that made space for Loretta's name on a label, and the promise of a kitchen that would carry both history and dignity. He suggested equal distribution, a small local factory partner he trusted, and most importantly, in Loretta's mind, the possibility that the sauce would be hers, publicly hers, on a shelf with her name. He did not offer to buy her out. He offered to stand beside her. The offer flared in her chest in the way that hope sometimes does. Hesitant, bright, brittle. What she had lived through in the months before had taught her that offers could be knifed away by clever hands. But Rowan spoke as if what mattered was the sauce, and the woman who kept its memory. He did not pretend around the awkwardness of her divorce. He spoke instead to the small, stubborn fact that the bottles existed, and that the paperwork was older. "You can keep the recipe," he said. "We can open doors together. You will be the name on the bottle." She wanted to ask whether he knew what it was like to have things moved without the owner's consent. To watch your life become a set of signatures you never read. She wanted to tell him about the nights she had sat with the photograph pressed to her chest, and wished that paper could be armor. Instead she looked at the bottles, then at the recipe book on the counter, pages browned, smudged with fingerprints, dog-eared at the lines where Estelle wrote, "How to know when it's enough." She thought of Ruthie's hands, and Miss Delia's memory, and the way the neighborhood streetlights picked out the steam when a pot boiled. She said yes to Rohan, in a way that left room for a lawyer to read the papers, and for a hearing to happen. Saying yes was a beginning that tied a present to a past. Rohan left a card and a promise to return with contacts and a plan. Not everyone saw it as a beginning. In the days after she filed to assert Tremaine original, as part of Estelle's estate, calls came she did not expect. A neighbor, who had known her when she had been Loretta Simmons, said she had seen Calvin enter a building that housed different things, offices with lawyers and men who knew how to argue an omission into ownership. Someone else mentioned a daughter who had been too close to the wrong conversations. Rumor is a rope you can climb or a trap you can fall in. The world rearranged itself again, this time with different hands moving the pieces. Camille Loretta's daughter did not come to Tremaine the second morning. She sent a text that said she was busy. Loretta felt the text like a stone in a shoe. She could walk, but it rubbed. She avoided naming the suspicion. She had to focus on the crates, the bottles, the recipe scrawled in margins that smelled like bay leaf and sugar. She had to focus on opening the ovens and letting the building breathe food again. At night, after they had swept and set a few mismatched chairs out on the sidewalk, Ruthie would sit across from Loretta on a metal stool and tell her stories about Estelle humming while she stirred the pot. She never put in more sugar than needed, Ruthie said. She'd taste it and say, "Not yet, baby, let it tell you when." Ruthie's hands were steady when she broke down old packages, and she insisted Loretta learn the order of things, how not to burn the onion, where the pepper sat in the cabinet, which herbs fostered heat, and which soothed it. Loretta wrote down Estelle's measures, and then crossed them out, and then wrote them again. She followed the rhythm of the recipes, like a new language, and slowly, the kitchen began to hum. She painted the counter with a coat of deep green and hung the photograph of Estelle, where anyone who walked in would see her face, smiling as if she might offer advice. At any moment, she placed a bottle of Tremaine Original in the center of each table. She wanted the sauce to be ordinary, to be the everyday companion to plates of collard greens and fried catfish. Ordinary, she thought, was radical. Legal papers are a different kind of language. From recipes, the filing she made was a precise, clinical thing. Names, dates, statutes hinted at but not named. Affidavits that traced a paper trail back to Estelle. The act of filing changed the shape of Tremaine's kitchen, the way a storm changes the outline of a shoreline. Her lawyer warned her gently that the filing could provoke counterclaims, that those who had assumed control might view this assertion as theft. She understood then that the world did not always like being corrected. On the morning she walked into the old courtroom to drop copies of the filing at the clerk's desk. The light was thin and cold. She felt younger than 58. And older than the day she left Tremaine for the city where she married. She filed the papers and walked back out into the sun, the paper folder feeling heavier in her hands than it had at the lawyer's office. On the walk back to Tremaine, someone leaned out of a car and hissed a rumor she could not parse. Later, a woman at the corner bodega whispered that people in high places had noticed the sudden appearance of a brand named after a woman they thought had been, at worst, a quaint memory. That night, after they locked the door, Loretta sat at the counter and uncapped a bottle. A little of the sauce dripped onto a napkin and she tasted it. Heat, acid, something like a memory of church kitchens and long conversations cut short by time. She thought of the legal world she had stepped into and wondered what it would cost to hold on to a thing that was, in every sense, that mattered, hers. She found herself repeating a question from the day the papers came. What do you own, if they take your name on a ledger? The answer arrived in the taste on her tongue. People could move numbers on a page, but they could not move the way a sauce sits in a neighborhood's memory. They could not summon Estelle back into the kitchen with a signature. They could not take the recipes that carried salt and mercy, and a way of frying okra so it kept its dignity. Rohan called, the next morning. He had been to market, and to a small facility, Indicator. He had a bottle of pickles, and a plan. He wanted to make sure Loretta wanted to be seen as the woman behind Tremaine original. He used words like legacy and equity, in a way that felt like a hand offered. Loretta listened and let the possibility of someone else's belief buoy her. She was careful with this hope. She wrapped the photograph in a paper towel that night, and placed it back into the pocket of her purse. She lay awake, thinking of doors, closed doors, that kept us safe. Closed doors that hide things, and the one door on Edgewood she had opened with $21,000. And a stubbornness that kept her moving forward. The bottles sat in the corner of the kitchen. The wax on their necks glinted like a small congregation of witnesses. It was a beginning, not a victory. She knew that. The filing was only the beginning of a paper trail, and a story that would not stay only in the kitchen. There were other hands at work now, people who understood how to move property on a ledger, and to argue that what is found during a transition belongs to the household that paid the bills. There were loyalties that might fray. There were conversations in boardrooms and in phone booths that she could not hear. That afternoon Miss Delia herself stepped through the door. She was smaller than Loretta had expected, and wore a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. She touched the bottles like someone touching an old friend's arm. I kept them in back just like I told you, she said, and the phrase was not defensive. It was a statement of fact, an offering. You didn't tell anybody? Loretta asked. The question was short and practical. Miss Delia shrugged and smiled, the sort of smile that knows you cannot hold back a story once it's out. Lord? Honey? I told Ruthie. I told a couple of regulars. I didn't think no one would raise a fuss about a few jars. Her voice made the jars ordinary, and therefore untouchable in another way. Why now? Loretta asked. She did not mean to sound sharp, but the hours of late had thinned her patience like worn fabric. Miss Delia looked at the photograph on the wall. Because folks start remembering when someone decides it's time, she said. Sometimes memories, all you got. There was a knock at the back door later, when the evening wore down, and the kitchen had settled into that quiet, when the hoods cooled, and the last of the light slipped away. Loretta opened it to find a man in a suit, with a card tucked under his fingertips. He introduced himself as a representative from an office that had been watching several property filings in the area. He did not offer a smile. He offered a date for a hearing, and a note that someone associated with the Simmons name might contest the claim. The paper he handed her was small and bureaucratic, but its presence was heavy. Loretta folded it, and tucked it into the same folder as the manufacturing agreement. She looked at the bottles again, 31 of them, and at the recipe book with its margin notes and blotched pages. She felt the tug between the two types of proof. The warmth of a bottle held in a hand, and the cold certainty of a document dated years before she ever signed her name. She set the paper on the counter, and walked to the window. Outside, a couple walked by with a stroller, their conversation private. A smell drifted in, a neighbor frying something that made the whole block suddenly hungrier. Loretta thought of all the small things that had outlived men's plans. Recipes hidden in shoeboxes, photographs tucked behind books, names spoken at tables where food was offered without question. She thought of the way memory keeps its own accounts. She placed a bottle in the center of the counter, stood with her palms on the cool laminate, and felt the room tilt toward a future that was unknown and oddly familiar. The knock of business and the knock of life arrived together now, the first from handshakes and lawyers, the second from people who would come through the door hungry for a meal and, perhaps, for a story. When the night closed in, Loretta turned the photograph toward the light, smoothed her hand over Estelle's face, and said, softly, to a woman who could not hear, "We'll see, we'll see," she had said to a photograph that could not answer. The words hung in the kitchen like steam. Outside, Edgewood settled into evening. Cars passed. A man called out an order for takeout somewhere down the block. Inside, Loretta turned back to the bottles in the folder, and the little stack of paper that was suddenly the hinge on which everything might turn. She did not expect the first blow to come from inside the family. Camille's absence from the restaurant grew teeth in the rumor mill. At first, Loretta blamed work and exhaustion. Then she noticed the pauses when she called. Then she found a voice message from someone who identified herself only as a concern. "Mrs. Simmons. I thought you ought to know Mr. Simmons might contest your claim. I heard it from someone who heard it from someone." The message did not name names. It mentioned boardrooms and whispers and a file already moving through channels Loretta had not known existed. A week later, the summons arrived. Calvin's attorneys filed a challenge, arguing, in the language of property and timing, that the bottles and the brand had been discovered in the course of the divorce, and therefore should be treated as marital property. It was a claim constructed with the same neatness Calvin had used when his office moved titles and accounts. The lawyers argued that the discovery occurred during a period of transition and that items found were subject to division. Loretta sat across from her lawyer in a small conference room the day the challenge came through. The blinds at the window drew pale bars on the carpet. Her hands were folded around a small paper cup of coffee that had gone tepid. Her lawyer slid a single, well-creased page across the table. "They're contesting it on the basis of discovery," she said. Her voice was low and careful. "They're saying these were unearthed in a marital context." She tapped the paper where the attorneys drafting tried to make timing an equal claim. Loretta's immediate thought was the photograph she had pressed to her chest for years, and the recipe books stained with the ghosts of dinners. She thought of the manufacturing agreement dated 1987. Those digits had that felt like a counterweight to the flimsy net Calvin's lawyers had thrown. She breathed and folded the challenge into the folder with Estelle's agreement, the two papers touching like rivals. Then came a phone call from Camille. It arrived while Loretta was pricing produce for the opening menu. The peppers were bright. The onions smelled of sweetness, and Loretta had a list of songs she wanted to play on the small radio in the dining room to make the space feel like a Sunday kitchen. The phone showed Camille's name. Loretta answered without thinking. "Mama," Camille said. Her voice not quite cracked, but threadbare, in a way Loretta recognized from other fights. "I'm sorry, then." The line slipped. When it resumed, Camille's words were clipped, as if someone else was watching over her shoulder. "They called. Calvin says the brand matters to him. He says he didn't know. I didn't know he'd go this far." Loretta listened. She did not hear an apology. She heard confusion and, under it, a pressure that sounded like the small, polite violence of living inside someone else's decisions. "Did you tell him where the bottles were?" Loretta asked. There was a long, brittle silence. "I didn't mean," Camille began. Then, as if pushed by an invisible hand, she said, "I told him you'd been talking with people about recipes. I thought maybe he'd help talk to lawyers. I didn't know he'd file." "Mama, I'm sorry." Words there, and then gone again. The call ended with the mechanical little click of connection severed. Loretta stood in the cold storage, the scent of onions and vinegar mingling, and pressed her palm to the counter until her nails went white. She kept the folder closed. Betrayal, when it happens in pieces, is a different shape than betrayal in a single act. It arrives as misprision, as a past message that becomes a lever. Loretta did not want to spend anger on Camille. She also could not pretend the leak had not hurt. The kitchen, which so recently had felt like an inheritance of steam and memory, now felt exposed to legal light. Calvin's challenge moved with the same discipline he had applied to other things. The papers were filed. The date for a hearing came up on a Monday that felt overcast even before Loretta left the house. She dressed simply. A dark dress, sensible shoes. The photograph folded into a small envelope in her purse. Ruthie came with her, not as a witness, initially, but because Ruthie had walked with Loretta through other kinds of small disasters, and because Loretta wanted a presence that felt like home. The courtroom itself was orderly and low-lit. A bailiff's voice announced the cause. The judge's robes made him seem larger than he was. When he leaned forward to speak, Calvin's counsel presented the argument in the precise, glazed voice of practiced objection. They framed the case tightly. The sauce, the bottles, the brand discovered during divorce should be subject to division. They offered affidavits that tried to locate the discovery within the sweep of marital property. Their case was polished in the ways of people who have argued things into being for years. Loretta's lawyer rose, and then let the document speak. He asked the court only to read one thing aloud. The manufacturing agreement, stamped, signed, and dated. A copy was handed to the clerk, who read, the delivery of the words carrying the weight of a time earlier than the marriage. Manufacturing agreement. Trame original, 1987. There was a pause. A small intake of breath from someone in the back row. The judge looked at the pages, then at Loretta, then at the lawyers. He did not make a grand oratory. He did not need to. He read, with the procedural clarity of a man whose job was to translate paper into household consequence. The dates: agreement dated 1987. Marriage recorded 1993. He looked at Calvin's counsel and said, simply, on the face of this record, the claim that the items are marital property lacks foundation. The judge's voice was a hinge closing. The challenge was dismissed. The dismissal was not fireworks. It was a precise, unadorned act of cancellation. In the room, some breathed, like they had been swimming, and finally found water to grab. Ruthie wept quietly into her handkerchief, and then scrubbed her face and smiled like a woman who had seen a long row of wrongs untangle themselves into right. Loretta felt both relief and the odd emptiness of a victory that came by the neutral mechanism of dates and signatures rather than feeling like a personal vindication. She had won because the paperwork sequence matched the truth she carried in her bones. But paper has a way of being noticed. The Falinga public estate cast a wider shadow than anyone in Tremaine could have foreseen. It triggered a pattern of inquiries. By the time Loretta hung the photograph back on the restaurant wall, a small buzz of official interest had begun to gather at the edges of other people's desks. Someone at a regulatory agency noticed that transactions had moved through accounts in ways that invited scrutiny. An investigator on a federal payroll opened a file and set to work. The probe was clinical and slow and patient in the ways of institutions. It took statements and subpoenas and a reading of the sorts of practices that, in another life, might have been kept neat within an envelope and gone unnoticed. The action on Loretta's folder was simple. A federal investigation was opened. The ripple moved outward. Names connected. A familiar trail. Loans, transfers. A string of office memos looked different when someone in an office began to trace intent, where before there had only been accounting. The transcript of that movement had human consequence. Devon, Calvin's son, who had been on a professional track and whose name had floated in law firm directories, found himself facing a sudden loss of status. Licensing boards do not act without cause, and a preliminary inquiry can freeze what a license allows. He lost his license. Doors he had expected to open shut. Calvin's firm felt the pressure too. Clients who did not want to be associated with an unfolding investigation began to drift away. Firm partnerships dissolved in the way that paper can dissolve a career, cultivated in offices. At the end of a string of quiet and public blows, Calvin himself faced professional ruin. He lost his license, his firm unraveled, and personal relationships he had thought secure began to fray in ways Loretta watched without joy. The report on the probe did not make criminal conclusions in the way tabloids narrate disasters. It instead recorded cold actions, investigations opened, licenses suspended, reputations wounded where there had been a sheen. Loretta did not celebrate these details in private. Her life had been taken apart, once. Her resilience had been the slow, steady kind, that kept hands busy, and heart centered on meals. Yet she recognized, in the changes around Calvin and his circle, the material consequences of practices that treat people as ledgers, and strip other people of the ordinary dignity of their labors. The most intimate consequence, Calvin losing the woman he had left. Loretta Ford arrived not as scandal, but as a private unraveling made public by the papers of clients and colleagues. People who had once wanted proximity to power retreated when the power looked brittle. The collapse was not something Loretta orchestrated. It was the shape of accountability in motion. She refused to gloat. Her joy was quieter. Relief that the brand and the work that had been boxed in Miss Delia's back room would be allowed to breathe again, and an odd satisfaction that the small things Estelle had made could matter enough to draw the attention that spelled consequence for those who had treated people and memories as entries on a ledger. Rohan's partnership plan matured in the shadow of these events. He visited often, and spoke plainly about distribution, and quality control, and the need to honor a legacy, without polishing it into someone else's gloss. "We'll do this our way," he said. The afternoon he returned with a contract that read like a set of promises, rather than an offer to buy. He wanted equal share, and a commitment that Loretta's name appear on the label. He wanted local production in a facility in Decatur he trusted, and a small first run that would go to neighborhood stores and to Tremaine's tables. Loretta read the contract slowly. The language was fairer than she expected. It preserved the manufacturing agreement's spirit, and kept decision-making in hands that would respect Estelle's recipe. She signed. The decision felt like returning a borrowed book to a library you loved. It felt like naming the source and handing it back to the neighborhood it had grown from. Between the legal filings and the kitchen work, Tremaine began to take on the shape of what Loretta had imagined in small moments. While sleeping on the floor by the counter, she hired Ruthie as a cook and manager. Ruthie reorganized the pantry with a precision that made sense of decades. She found a small lineup of servers who had worked the line at local spots for years and understood the economy of plates. Miss Delia came by and sat at the counter as one of the first customers, and she watched the dining room fill with a kind of awe that felt like the slow recognition of a long-kept secret finally acknowledged. Opening night was both simple and ceremonial. The photograph of Estelle went up on the wall in a frame that caught the light. Loretta placed it where the window's morning glow would touch it first. She set a bottle of Tremaine original on each table, and wrapped burnished napkins, and ordered a pot of collard greens, whose smell unfurled down Edgewood the way sermons used to spill from churches on Sundays. Simple things: fried catfish, macaroni, the way Estelle liked it. Cornbread with edges that cracked arrived on plates that looked like small offerings. Each plate carried a spoonful of a sauce that immediately, in the mouths of the first customers, did what it was meant to do. It anchored the food and the room in a lineage of taste. Lines developed faster than she expected. People who had eaten at Estelle's table as children dragged old friends back. Neighborhood regulars came to stand at the counter and tell stories, and point out people in the room who had been there when Loretta was a girl. The old Fourth Ward and surrounding blocks pooled in a way that felt like return. Strangers came because of a mention in a food column that Rohan had placed with the discretion of someone who respects what he revives. Friends came because Ruthie had called her network. Curious passers-by were drawn in by the smell and the sight of people talking loudly and smiling. Laughter rose nightly, like steam. On a night when the rain skittered against the street, and the din of the kitchen had a particular urgency, Rowan stepped into the dining room, tasted a spoonful, and nodded. "This will travel," he said. But he did not mean a shelf in a supermarket as the only measure. He meant that the sauce would migrate in mouths and memories the way a song moves from singer to singer. He meant that the brand would carry with it the story of the woman who had kept the bottles alive in a back room and then opened a door with $21,000 and stubbornness. Loretta watched the room. She kept moving between the line and the counter, handing over plates, taking quick orders with the sort of economy that comes when hands have done this work a long time. She noticed people paying attention to the photograph, to the label, to the way Ruthie ladled sauce on the sides of plates like a benediction. She watched family tables and couples, and a man in a suit, who had been the first to book a reservation the week before. He sat in a corner and ate, with his eyes closed. She felt, in those small observations, a restoration that had nothing to do with courtrooms, and everything to do with presence. As business grew, so did the rhythm of small repairs. Loretta paid invoices and balanced deliveries. She signed agreements that did not feel like erasures. She kept the recipe book open in a drawer near the range, and sometimes her hands learned a measurement Estelle had only ever given as a look. More, when the pot says it's ready. She taught younger cooks to listen to the pan, to smell for the sugar that would calm the heat. Ruthie became a partner in the work, not only in service, but in the choices that made a kitchen run. The supplier to call when the greens were late, the sauce proportion that made a half bottle stretch across a table. The small, vital economies that make flavor consistent. The community's return was not simply economic. Tremaine became a place where conversations that had been quieted found space to breathe. Neighbors met landlords there. Old friends reconciled their own small grievances over plates. People who had once been counted as background, who cooked for other people's parties, who taught kids to fish, who ran errands for those who needed them, sat down at tables and felt seen. Loretta listened to these conversations with a kind of gratitude that was almost reverent. Not everything smoothed over. Camille and Loretta had conversations that creaked. They did not always land easily. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a practice. Loretta tended to her daughter with the same careful measures she gave a pot of sauce. They returned to old stories, to the recipe book, to the photograph. Some apologies were uttered, some things were left unspoken for a long time. In public, Loretta kept the door open. One afternoon, while Loretta was on the line, plating up a special for a table of elders, a reporter from a local public radio station asked if she would speak about Estelle, and about what it meant to reclaim something that had been nearly let go. Loretta agreed. She spoke in plain terms. About taste as memory. About a woman who saved jars in the back of a counter in Decatur. About the way papers dated before her marriage had made a legal difference. She did not paint villains. She described processes, and the wonder of a recipe that had waited. The public attention was gentle and steady. It brought more customers, but it also brought scrutiny, questions about manufacturing and distribution, and how the sauce would be bottled, and where. Rohan handled much of the technical side. He arranged a small run in Decatur, and then a second and a third. The first 1,000 jars sold in days at Tremaine, and at a handful of neighborhood shelves. People wrote to say, the sauce tasted like Sunday, or like a grandmother's hand. Some wrote to ask if Loretta would put her name on the label. She did. On the label, in small print beneath Estelle's name, read the line that made her chest tighten. Made by the heirs of Estelle May Williams, Loretta Siemens. There was a moment, months out from the first opening, when all the small things lined up in a way that felt like an answer. A photograph hung where the morning light could touch it. 31 bottles had become 1,000, and then more. The restaurant had a steady flow, and a staff who knew how to move through the rush without panic. Ruthie came to work each morning with a smile, and a way of calling the orders that sounded like poetry. Miss Delia stopped by with a box of old menus, and some hand-sewn napkins that she insisted Loretta keep for when things get proper. Loretta sometimes woke and thought of the cardboard box the lawyer had once said would hold her life. She thought how wrong that voice had been. Her life had contained a chemical ledger of grief, and a cache of small inventions, and a community that had not stopped being itself, even when some part of the ledger tried to domesticate it. The truth one that the bottles carried and that the recipe book taught was that some assets do not show up on balance sheets until they are asked to. They are measured in mouths and memories. They are recorded when people speak the names aloud again. Where the story had once looked like loss, it began to show itself as a different kind of gain. Agency, a living business, and a place that returned what had been hidden to the neighborhood that had always known it mattered. Loretta did not become wealthy overnight. The business required attention and nights, when the bills felt like weights. But there was a dignity to the work that could not be taken by deed or trust. She paid Steph. She kept the recipe intact, and when the first local grocery asked for a small distribution deal that would keep production transparent and local, she and Rowan read every line and refused to sign anything that made the sauce someone else's story. Time brought the quiet consequences of the probe to its own plateau. Calvin's firm declined, Devon's license did not return in a hurry, and the professional future he had imagined rerouted into something narrower. Public records showed investigations and suspended licensure. Clients who had once trusted the name arranged their affairs elsewhere. For Loretta, these were not trophies. They were, instead, the civic accounting of actions laid against public attention. She did not gloat at the dinner table when Ruthie served her the last of the collard greens. She felt the weight of many things. The way righting an old wrong can cause new fractures. The way community repair requires tending. Not everyone forgave. Not everyone forgot. There were neighbors who kept distance. And there were conversations with Camille that would take years to be fully comfortable. But a new set of accounts had been written. The label that bore Estelle's name, and Loretta's, a kitchen that fed people, and paid salaries. A small factory indicator that bottled according to the older measures. Tremaine became a place people recognized in ways that mattered beyond a food column. It became an anchor. People who had once been background were now staff, sharing in the prosperity in ways that felt fair. The evening of Tremaine's first anniversary felt like a quiet liturgy. The dining room still modest, still with mismatched chairs, and the same cracked counter was full, the sound of plates, the soft clatter of silverware, the way people leaned toward one another to speak. All of it was a kind of music. Ruthie moved through the room, smiling at Regulus, adjusting a napkin here, and offering a private joke there. Miss Delia sat at the corner booth and tapped her fingers on the table as if counting time in a rhythm only she could hear. Loretta stood by the doorway and watched. The photograph of Estelle leaned in the lamplight. She felt a fullness that was not triumphal so much as resolved. The sauce and the restaurant had given back more than a business. They had returned a name to the neighborhood and anchored a lineage in a way that paper had tried to erase. She thought about the man who had left her at 50 at Tond. About what he had missed. He had arranged papers and titles, shuffled deeds, like cards. He had thought the shape of a life could be made from signatures and accounts. He had not, apparently, thought to value the things that do not show up on ledgers. The exact pinch of cayenne, the way a photograph can keep a person alive in the folds of its paper. The work of hands that learned measures by feel rather than numbers. The last part of the story was simple and a little ironic. The men who had traded on the assumption that what counted was on a ledger found themselves struggling where numbers once guided them. Professional doors closed. Positions evaporated. Rumors of investigations and suspended licenses moved like weather. The bandaging of the world is not always neat. People who had arranged their lives around Dominion found that Dominion porous when someone else read the papers. Loretta did not feel vindictive. She felt, instead, a deep sense of restoration and a tempered compassion. The restoration was not about punishment, it was about the world recognizing what it had overlooked. There is a moral geometry to these things. Those who try to capture others' labor for themselves find, sometimes, that the world has ways of redistributing consequence. On a quiet afternoon, after the anniversary, when the kitchen had a lull, and the light through the back window made the sauce glow like small embers, Loretta sat with Ruthie and a stack of order sheets. The radio played quietly an old hymn, threaded with a jazz line, and Ruthie told a story about when Estelle once sent a jar of sauce to a neighbor who had been gone to war. She wanted him to come home and taste it, Ruthie said. Her eyes were bright. Loretta listened and felt the cramped, bright relief of someone who knows she is living out the second half of what her grandmother started. Before she closed for the evening, Loretta walked to the shelf where a line of Tremaine original bottles sat in a neat row. 31 had been the beginning. There were now many hundreds. Each label carried, beneath, Estelle's name. The line that made Loretta feel like she had at last been seen. Made by the heirs of Estelle May Williams, Loretta Shimonza. She touched a bottle, feeling the glass cool and the wax on the cap ridged and familiar. She thought of all the doors she had opened with small and stubborn courage. The door on Edgewood she had bought with $21,000. The soft door of Ruthie's friendship. The courthouse door that read dates aloud. The larger doors of the neighborhood that let neighbors in, again. She had been 58 the morning the papers came. She had been 58 when she spent the money and slept on the floor by the counter. She had been 58 when she opened a storage door and found a life's worth of small proof. The title that people would repeat. He left her after 58 years, as she preferred in truth. He left her when she was 58. Framed the shock in a way the world noticed. But the larger shock was the thing he had not seen. The three things that men on ledgers ignore at their peril: skill, memory, and community. If you stand in a kitchen long enough, you learn a simple lesson. The most valuable things are often the ones you can feed to someone. Estelle had taught that. Loretta had lived it. The sauce became not just a product, but a testament that the work people do with their hands, when honored and protected, can remake a life. What would you do in Loretta's place? Would mercy be your response? Or would you let the consequences of someone's choices play out without interference? There are no easy answers. Loretta chose steadiness, repair, over revenge, restoration, over spectacle. She left space for responsibility, and the possibility of a future that included both justice and compassion. If this story moved you, share it with someone who values quiet resilience, and tell us in the comments, would you forgive, or would you let the consequences stand?